Welcome to Podcast to Connect. If you are using a podcast or want to use a podcast to find your people and make connections with them, whether it be for business or community purpose, then this is the place for you. Hi, I'm Steph from Coffee Like Media, and I've been podcasting for quite a while. And I have definitely grown my community and my business, both from podcasting as well as supporting mediums like newsletters and YouTube channels. And we'll talk all about that, don't worry. But I wanted to share some of the things that I have learned throughout the years, as well as some of the conversations I'm having with people about the different things we're doing to connect to folks in the podcasting space and what glorious things come out of those connections. In this first season, I'm repurposing episodes from earlier versions of Podcast to Connect, one of which was a 30-day experience called National Podcast Post Month, where a bunch of editors came on to the podcast and gave tips and advice on how to maneuver your podcast to sound good. And then it grew from there into more of the connective and outreach and community focus of podcasting. I've taken a smattering of both of those flavors, and here are 11 of those that I think give you a variety, a bouquet, a rainbow, shall we say, of different tips that I think will help your business or community podcast. If you need help with your podcast, feel free to reach out to me at coffeelikemedia.com. All right, let's get on with today's tip. Our first guest this season is Rebecca Weber. She's originally from the U.S., like me, a longtime resident of South Africa, not like me, and she currently lives near a penguin colony in Cape Town, which we might have to ask her about later. Rebecca has covered social justice, the environment, the arts, travel, and more for CNN, USA Today, the New York Times, Dwell, and many other publications. Personally, I heard of her a few years ago from a freelance writing friend who recommended the Writing Coach podcast, which is hers. And that's where we're pitching our Connections tent today in this podcast. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This is going to be one of those things where if I get really quiet, it's because I'm used to listening to you alone with my earbuds, and I might forget that you're actually here live.
The interactive quality. Yeah. And I should just say, I actually usually read your newsletter as opposed to hear you speaking out loud. I have watched some of your, like the video, can I say video podcast? I feel like I don't even have the lingo down. So yeah, it's a different kind of experience for both of us, but we do actually already have these existing connections, this is why I found this topic so interesting, because we do have relationships with the people whose words we're reading or hearing that is so different than what we're doing right now in real time.
It's so true. It's so true. And I do think that that's an under talked about, if that's even a word, a not as talked about topic within podcasting, because it's not directly monetizable, but it's fruitful. It's just fruitful. Well, let's dive in. How long has the podcast and newsletter been going for? Give us a time frame.
The podcast has been going since the end of 2018. I think September 2018 launched. And other than about 2 months that I took a break when I had COVID, other than that, it's been weekly pretty much and some bonus episodes in there. And the newsletter, I don't actually know. I looked it up in my current email provider, ConvertKit. It's been going since 2016, but I had MailChimp before that. I don't remember. Maybe a year or two before that. And there were a bunch of people that I just sort of migrated over all in one day.
Interesting. So the newsletter was first.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you start the podcast in addition to the newsletter?
The podcast really came out. A writer friend of mine suggested that I do a podcast. And initially, as I do with so many things, when I hear a new idea, I say no. So I'm used to myself saying no. But by the evening, I was kind of like, that's actually a good idea. And my reasons of saying no was because I was writing this newsletter for writers in 2018 when all anybody was talking about was video. And I was like, I hate watching video. It's so slow. The automatic subtitles weren't common. And so I just felt like it was slow. And I felt like my people, my audience, they also can read quickly. They don't need to watch a video. And so I really thought I prefer reading a newsletter to watching video. it was like I was having a brain fart about podcasts not being video, basically. But then when I thought about it that day and she was suggesting doing a podcast, I was like, you know what? I have such great relationship in my own head with the podcast hosts that I listen to. And if I make this switch, I can actually do longer form on the podcast than I can do in email. So oftentimes my emails were relatively long, but nobody wants to read a 10,000 word email. I mean, certainly not every week. I certainly don't want to write them either.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the idea, was to be able to have a different kind of connection. And also I thought be able to dive deeper into some of the concepts that, I wasn't trying to write a book chapter every week in the newsletter. And it just sort of seemed like a good bridge.
Well, that brings up a question then. Did the podcast take some of the content? Like, did your content in the newsletter shift when you started to do the podcast? Did the podcast take over? I can't find a positive word for this. What am I trying to say here? Did they start to share different roles when you started to do the podcast, I guess?
Yeah, I think that initially I actually was really doing an individual newsletter, like a broadcast message and a podcast specific message each week. So I really was just sort of adding and creating more work initially. And I do sometimes still do that, but usually my new newsletters are very closely related to the content on the podcast that week. And in particular, as it turns out, I have so many more people reading the newsletter than I do listening to the podcast. So it's not like they're like, oh, I've already heard this, because they're never going to hear it. They're never going to click through, or they're not subscribing. So for me, it's a very easy way to repurpose. I do it a little bit differently in written form, but that's usually where the weekly content is coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's all connected and pointing to each other, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I just got a tip from watching, I was sort of watching one of your episodes just the other day, since you had just been talking about doing a podcast rebrand, and I was like, oh, what is it? I better find out. And there was a tip that I really like that I haven't been doing, is that although I include links to, click here to listen or subscribe with these places, what I don't do is in my newsletter, I don't refer back to several previous episodes. I include that in the show notes, but most of my people aren't making it to the show notes. So last night I just said, oh, why don't I try dropping in the 3 links that are in the show notes into the body of the email, and let's see what happens. Let's see. I can only imagine that more people will click a link than have done so previously. I'm sort of curious to see how that plays out.
As am I. Let me know how it turns out, because I've been connecting my stuff more and more and more ever since I heard the term flywheel, like connecting all of your stuff so it starts to kind of self-generate, and then your audience starts to promote more than you do. Like, that's the ultimate goal. And I'm like, that would be great, because promotion, I'd rather spend the time creating than promoting. So that would be amazing. So yeah, remembering to do all of that after the purge of creations is really hard to remember. But what you said about you have more people in the newsletter than the podcast was an interesting thing that you mentioned when we were chatting via email, because you also said that although that's true, there are more newsletter subscribers than podcast listeners, more of your clients for your business come from the podcast. Can you unpack that one a little bit more?
Yeah. So I have people fill in a short application when they're interested in working with me. And one of the non-required questions at the very end is just, how do you hear about me? How do you first hear about me? And most people refer to the podcast. That's what most people say. I know it's possible that they're actually on the newsletter first, and then the podcast is the thing that sort of sticks with them. I'm not sure how accurate people's self-reporting is, but clearly that's the thing that makes the bigger impact. Yeah. And that's the one that the people who actually wind up working with me overwhelmingly say that. So clearly that idea about like forging those deep connections is true. I mean, it's a lot more of an investment to listen to a whole bunch of podcast episodes, or even 3 good ones that make you say like, ooh, like I want to, I'm interested in working with this person. It's a lot more than, putting in your email address and just getting signing up for a newsletter. So yeah, that's been the overwhelming shift. And I do think that I expect that will continue to be the case, because although I do get some referrals, and that's the sort of other place that people will say, they'll say either so-and-so referred me, or I've been getting your emails for a while. Those are much less so than anything else. When I very first started, when I just had the newsletter, referral was the main thing, or they actually already knew me. They knew me personally because we were in a writers group or journalism association or something like that.
Yeah.
And that has really taken much smaller role.
And this is what I love. What is it about voices? Because you mentioned as a listener, the thing that made you realize that having a podcast wouldn't be awful is your relationship in your head with the host that you listen to. Like, what is it about voices that as a podcast listener, really resonates with you? What is it that, I don't know, that's it, that really resonates?
Well, I know that for me, and I don't know that this is true for everyone, but I know that for me, I tend to listen to podcasts while I'm out, like primarily walking the dog is my main space.
Aww.
And so I'm in motion, and I am a very kinesthetic learner. So I really think that I absorb a lot more because I'm in motion, as opposed to, I used to listen to talk radio a lot in the car, and I didn't retain things as much, and I didn't have as much of a fantasy relationship, even though I really like talk radio. I feel like because they're in my ear like that, the only other people who talk to me on my phone really are my parents and a few close friends. And so they get that sort of special space and time. Mm-hmm. I think that the motion really helps for me. I mean, I am somebody who, generally speaking, if I read something, I do tend to retain it better than listening. But with the podcast, when I'm moving and when I hear them again and again, it does seem so personal. It seems like it's one of my friends who's leaving me a voice note a lot of the time.
It really does. And when I meet people on a consult or just with a like, hey, let me help you with this one thing you're really struggling with, or whatever reason, podcasting-ish stuff to help people with, when I meet them in a video call and they've consumed something, there's a different state of relaxation that we start the conversation with. Yeah. Than if it was a completely cold, you know something about podcasting, you can help me out kind of, I know your social handle kind of relationship. Have you had that kind of different starting point with folks who were following the podcast first?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, sometimes it's a little bit awkward on my side because sometimes they're like, oh my gosh, it's really you. And I'm like, you, what? It's like, I'm usually just sitting at my desk talking to myself instead of walking around town, holding up my phone, talking to myself. So they often do, though, indicate that early on. And a lot of times on those consults, they are just expressing what they've already learned. They're almost like telling me what they've already learned from the podcast or taken away or how they've applied it. And those people almost always are like, how do we move forward to the next thing? Like they're ready. Like they don't really need a consult in that more traditional sense that when I started the podcast, I would normally have a short phone call with everyone or a Zoom call with pretty much everyone to talk about what it would be like to work together. And at this point, most people don't need one. They don't want one. They don't need one. But when they do have one, there's a big difference between somebody who's not familiar with my approach and somebody who's like, yep, I've been listening for a few years and the time is right. It's a different entry point, like you say.
Yeah. I love the phrase voice meet. I voice met them, so it was fine. I didn't actually need a whole lot of that intro, that awkwardness that can be there at the beginning. But I want to know more about the book because you're about to start sending your book around. Is that correct?
Well, the idea is that I will be sending out the book proposal to agents, and then agents will shop it to publishers. And I hope to go that traditional book publishing route. That's my plan at this point in time.
Gotcha. How would you describe the vulnerability aspect or the difference between writing a book and putting it out there versus a podcast?
I think it's a really good question. The vulnerability that I experienced initially when I really first started was around the fact that my audience are the media, right? And I knew that a lot of my people either produce or create broadcast quality audio and video. Mm-hmm. And so I was really concerned about my ability. Like I know that my stuff can't just go to the BBC as is, right? And so I had a lot of concern about that. And that was my biggest vulnerability point initially, was just the critique that I felt like I was opening myself up to. I wasn't overly concerned from a vulnerability point of view about the quality of the content, like the words themselves, I felt pretty solid about. And I think that, look, actually, we should probably talk again when it comes time for the book to actually come out. But right now, the vulnerability point is actually just even expressing that it's happening to anybody outside of my super immediate circle, because there is this whole question of, will it work? Won't it work? Mm-hmm. If it does quote unquote work, how well does it work? Mm-hmm. It's a given that people are going to not like it, are going to reject it. That might be the agents, that might be the editors, that might be the people who are reviewing it, that might be the people that are reading it, the people who are reviewing it on Amazon. Like, at every stage, there's going to be people who don't like it. And knowing that, sort of reminding yourself, on the one hand, I'm very familiar with rejection, but it's just sort of a different medium. And I feel like it's one that I still have a lot of respect for. You know, the notion of writing a book still seems like an important part of the way that we have conversations with people and communicate ideas. So yeah, there's a lot of vulnerability there. And I did mention it on my podcast. I said on the podcast.
I just pulled the episode up because I wanted to talk about it when you were done. I was like, I really love the fact that you spent an entire episode talking about the vulnerability of just saying that you're about to do this really impressive thing, but really scary thing, because it might not go anywhere, but it might. It will, but it might. Yeah.
I did actually mention a few years ago also that I was doing the same thing. I mean, there was an earlier book proposal that didn't work out. Yeah. So, it's not just like a fake humbleness of like, oh, I don't know if this will work. It's like, I really wanted to, but it's reality. Yeah. So, and I also felt like being able to talk about that from an authentic vulnerability point of view, it was pretty real. As like, let's talk about this. It's one of the things I talk about in the podcast is the sort of psychological and emotional side of doing this work. I'm not normally part of the story that I'm reporting, but there are all these background narratives that we have. And so it just seems to me like a good ripe example to talk about vulnerability.
I love background stuff. I think that's what I like about like process podcasts, is we get to see that part that never makes it into the polished bit. And I love the unpolished bits. Not that your episode was unpolished, but
no, they're quite unpolished. As I said, they are just sort of me sitting at my desk talking to myself. As how it is actually a lot of times. But I think that it's a real interesting thing to look at the process and to be reminded of how much there is that goes into that final 1 minute of audio. There's so much that goes into, there can be years of background that we never know about for them to be able to deliver that. Oh, what a funny anecdote.
So true. And I forgot to ask you, can you reveal I know it's about writing probably, but what is the book about?
Yeah, I don't really have a soundbite version of it yet. It is about writing. It is about mindset for writers.
Nice.
And some of the concepts that are there that I already explore in the Writing Coach podcast will come out. But one of the things that I maybe didn't intend so much for my podcast is it has gotten really incredibly specifically super niche in a lot of the episodes, which I think is great and useful for the people that it relates to. But I just also feel like a lot of the broader concepts apply and could be useful for more people. And so the book is intended more for people who write.
Yeah. And I actually pull a bunch of your episodes over into my podcast editing newsletter for the business side, for the freelancing side, for the how do you deal with the pricing or the mindset or those kinds of things. And I go, look, just replace the word writer with editor, and it just podcast editor, and it just totally maps over all the time. Like I'm pulling those episodes over. So it's niche, but it also applies to other situations that are similar.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I do hear that occasionally from people. There's, an actor who said sort of something similar. Like, this all applies. There's just there's part of the creative process that tracks. And then the specific examples that I use are usually journalism and freelance specific. And so that little niche audience feels like it's just for them. But the book will not be quite as specific, quite as dialed into that frequency.
Yeah. Well, if folks want to find you online before the book comes out, what's the best place for them to do that?
I think the best place is the Writing Coach podcast. I'm not super active on social media. I am over on Instagram is the place that I am sometimes. You say smart to not be on social media.
Yes. I'm moving to Pinterest and the newsletter. I'm like putting more time into things that have like a longer tail than shorter stuff, but it's taking a while to leaf over. Anyway, but yeah, I look forward to not checking stuff on a daily basis at some point in the future. But thank you so much for coming on here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It was really a pleasure to connect in real time with you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Podcast to Connect. I'll have all of the information in the show notes or video notes, depending on where you are consuming this. Again, Podcast to Connect is available in audio and video format. And if you need any help with your podcast, feel free to reach out at coffeelikemedia.com. Thanks so much. Bye.